Hi. Okay, so in addressing my response to this video, I'm first going to go through a brief overview of the phases, and then I will address the needs and challenges of each of these phases, and then subsequently we'll go through some interventions for each of these phases, and in the end, I'm going to kind of tie it all together and reference how these phases of disaster are related to a recent disaster that we all experienced, COVID-19. Um, so, in a brief overview of the phases, the first one is the heroic phase, and that is characterized by, a lot of the community coming together, a lot of noble efforts being made to help whatever disaster is at hand. This is followed by the honeymoon phase, where people are kind of focused on like the feel good stories of what happened and kind of reveling in that sense of community. This is followed by the disillusionment phase, and that's kind of when people start to move on a little bit. Organizations may start to pull out their support, and this can be characterized by a lot of feelings of anger and resentment, kind of feeling abandoned. This is followed by the reconstruction phase, and this can last a very long time after the disaster, over the course of years, even. Um, and it's kind of when people start to return to a new sense of normalcy following a disaster. Um, it's important to keep these phases in mind because knowledge of these phases can kind of help counselors in figuring out how to best help the survivors. By identifying what phase they're in, they can figure out how to deal with the emotional responses that people may be experiencing. And knowledge of these phases can also help counselors educate the community and kind of validate the feelings that they're feeling and like what's normal for what stage of the crisis. For example, like in the disillusionment phase, counselors can educate the community in saying that like it's not that people don't care, it's just kind of an adjustment back to the normal phase of life. So now we're going to get into the needs and challenges of each phase. So starting with the heroic phase, this phase is characterized by a lot of denial. So that's denial of the impact that the disaster may have on homes, on families, on the community in general. People may utilize extraordinary measures to protect their homes and families, stockpile a lot of resources. It's also characterized by people coming together and forming community. I remember during Hurricane Harvey, there was kind of a monumental effort of first responders, and everyone had a lot of pride in Houston for the magnitude of the response that occurred. Um, During this phase, people also don't often realize that it's kind of a long-term event, so it's more of like they treat it more like a sprint than a marathon, so it's kind of this one massive effort without thoughts of how long that is kind of sustainable. And so that's why post-heroic phase, it can often lead to a lot of feelings of burnout or fatigue. Addressing the emotional, physical, and spiritual impact of the heroic phase, there is kind of a greater, people are more focused on the problem at hand, so there might not be as much spirituality addressed during this time, but generally people might turn to their higher power during this phase. People could be very open to religion. Emotionally, denial is very characteristic because, this is kind of a coping mechanism in the moment. You can't focus on the long-term effects because you need to be so present in addressing the situation at hand. Moving on to the honeymoon phase, disaster survivors, this time is kind of characterized by a lot of feelings of a lot of gratitude, like maybe we'll get past this, everything's going to be okay. It's kind of like the first uptick after the disaster itself has passed and the dust kind of settles. Everyone's kind of, you know, feeling a little bit more like normal. But during this phase, you're kind of coming down from the excitement and the energy of the heroic phase, so people can hit a crash point. This was referenced in the video, and this is kind of when that fatigue really sets in. I feel like this is really characteristic of immediate disaster survivors, and also the first responders that kind of put forth that monumental effort in the first place. So moving on from here, we look at the needs and challenges of the disillusionment phase. So during this time, disaster survivors realize that this is going to take a lot longer. This is when the dust starts to settle a bit more and people kind of realize that like the support that they had in the very beginning might not be there in the long term. So this can lead to a lot of feelings of hopelessness, abandonment. This is kind of when the realizations about the long-term effects of this disaster start to set in. So there may be fear about financial future, just kind of intense feelings of a loss of security, helplessness, anger, and a sense of futility. And this is when people, as referenced in the video, people kind of start seeking mental health help. They start realizing the long-term mental health effects that this sort of disaster has on disaster survivors. And all of this occurs over a very long-term process. So this is when we move into the reconstruction phase, which can last years after the disaster, but this is when a new normal is starting to develop. And this can be marked by a sense of growth. The community is not going to return to the position that it was in before. It's going to be forever changed. There's going to be a lot more pre-disaster responses put in place. I know following COVID or post-COVID, there's a lot of, health measures put in place in case anything else like this were to happen again. So the community has kind of grown from the disaster itself. However, this phase can also be marked by, the trauma really starts to set in, and people may turn to unhealthy coping mechanisms, such as addiction, domestic violence, gambling, alcohol, and drug use. So moving on to interventions, we're going to look at the pre-disaster phase first. So some really helpful tips for the pre-disaster phase is really preparation. So providing trainings, developing disaster plans, focusing Bible studies around spiritual disaster preparedness. Collaboration is also really important. This was something that was emphasized a lot in the video as well, but establishing that collaboration with other organizations prior to another disaster happening so that you have those resources when the time comes, so you're not scrambling and you're not lost. Looking at interventions for the disaster phase, so this is actually when the actual disaster hits. Some tips for this phase is checking on various people, utilizing plans, collecting materials, and preparing for a response, and then also normalizing the disaster response, I feel like is really important. People may have, a lot of emotions around this time, and recognizing that those emotions are very valid and that it is normal for a disaster of that magnitude. Looking at interventions for the heroic phase, this is when you can respond to the community impacted. You're addressing the most basic needs, safety, shelter, looking at Maslow's hierarchy. Like, we need to get those first basic needs met when people are kind of putting forth this massive effort. Looking at interventions for the honeymoon phase, this is when people are still kind of riding that high of the disaster. So during this time, it could be really helpful to put forth some fundraising efforts. You also need to be aware of the fatigue. This is kind of when the crash point occurs. So this is when you could also start assessing for trauma, PTSD, administering psychological first aid, making referrals to mental health professionals, plans for long-term recovery, and then addressing interventions for the disillusionment phase. This is when the support kind of starts to wane a little bit. So providing support while other nonprofits start to kind of move away, focusing on burnout prevention for people that are still providing those direct services. Really emphasizing mental health services. So that's mental health training, referring people to external resources, fostering, kind of trying to help maintain that sense of hope, despite the feelings of anger and resentment that may come up. And fostering that sense of community during this phase is really important, and focusing on the community that's been impacted. Finally, moving on to interventions for the reconstruction phase. This is when you can kind of really celebrate that growth due to positive changes. You also need to focus on the long-term effects during this phase. So this is when those, counseling for trauma or PTSD really come into play. And using the knowledge that you learned from this disaster to help other communities or churches when disaster hits. Community is a very key element of interventions during the reconstruction phase. So looking back on COVID-19 and how this could kind of apply to that. I think a lot of nurses were really, or a lot of first responders really felt the impacts of the disillusionment phase pretty significantly. Um, that's when a lot of burnout can occur. So, burnout is the result of cumulative environmental stressors that lead to emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and cynicism, and a loss of a sense of personal accomplishment. So, after everyone kind of put forth that significant effort, they're going to be feeling those effects of constantly having to help. So, some techniques that could be useful for pushing through that burnout are self-care activities, resilience building, so mindfulness practices, gratitude, peer support, self-compassion. This could be helpful in addressing secondary traumatic stress and preventing PTSD. There's also the issue of cumulative grief that can occur as a result of large-scale disasters. Cumulative grief occurs when death and loss accumulate faster than the pace of a person's natural grieving process. So it can manifest in a few different ways: persistent sadness, anger, dull sense that, I can't do anymore. So to process this kind of grief, you can promote authentic connections and create rituals such as with prayer. So, in conclusion, I apologize for the background noise. But in conclusion, those were an overview of the phases of disaster response, the needs and challenges, and the interventions that are appropriate for those phases of disaster response. For this video, I referenced Fundamentals of Crisis Counseling by Miller and an article called Beyond Burnout and Resilience, the Disillusionment Phase of COVID-19. And that was written by Perry M. Gee, Marla J. Weston, Tom Harshman, and Leslie A. Kelly, and it was published in 2022. Thank you.